An anonymous sketch slips through an old lady's letterbox. A moonlit village square. A top-hatted corpse, dead at 11:23. She draws the empty space, waits, and the body falls exactly where the pencil predicted. More sketches arrive, each foretelling murder, each delivered by hand. With graphite and a loaded Webley, Mrs. Elspeth Harrowby unravels a killer who draws death before it happens, until the final picture proves the artist is closer than the grave itself. Chapter 1. The Sketch in the Post. Rose Cottage stood at the end of a lane so narrow that the milk cart had to reverse out again, its wheels grinding against the flint wall like a reluctant confession. The cottage itself was low and pink-washed, with a porch strangled by clematis and a door that opened directly into the sitting room, as though the house were too impatient for hallways. Mrs. Elspeth Harrowby had lived there alone for 20 years, ever since her brother the canon died of a chill caught while cataloging missals in a damp vestry. She was 73, upright as a ruler, and dressed always in dove-gray wool that matched the color of her eyes when she was thinking. Every morning at 8:30 the postman, Mr. Giddings, pushed his bicycle up the lane and slid the letters through the brass flap with a clatter that served as a breakfast bell. On this particular Tuesday, the clatter was softer, almost furtive. Mrs. Harrowby, already at the table with her cup of China tea and a slice of brown bread thinly buttered, looked up. One envelope lay on the mat, thick, cream-laid, sealed with a blob of scarlet wax, impressed by a signet she did not recognize. The address was written in a hand both elegant and impatient, the downstrokes sharp enough to cut paper. She carried it to the window, where the light fell clear across the geraniums. The seal gave with a small, satisfactory crack. Inside was a single sheet of heavy drawing paper, folded twice. When she unfolded it, the village square leapt out at her, rendered in pencil with a precision that made her catch her breath. Every slate on the roof of the post office, every iron hoop on the horse trough, every curl of smoke from the chimney of the anchor, nothing had escaped the artist's eye. At the center of the square, directly beneath the memorial cross, lay the outline of a man. He was drawn from above, as though the artist had stood on the church tower. A top hat lay overturned beside the head. One gloved hand still grasped a silver-topped cane. The figure was not sprawled in the abandon of accident, but arranged with the stiff propriety of a corpse in a Victorian photograph. There was no blood, no wound, only the suggestion of finality in the angle of the limbs and the emptiness of the face. Mrs. Harrowby adjusted her pince-nez and studied the margins. The paper was Whodunit, the pencil A2B, the cross-hatching so fine it might have been etched. On the reverse, in the same neat copperplate, he fell at 23 minutes past 11. Watch the clock on the memorial. No signature, no date. The envelope bore no stamp. It had been delivered by hand. She laid the sketch on the table beside her cooling tea and considered it the way another woman might consider a telegram announcing a death in the family. Then she rose, fetched her own sketchbook from the bureau, and opened it to a fresh page. With quick, decisive strokes, she copied the anonymous drawing, omitting only the body. The square looked naked without it, like a stage before the curtain rises. Outside, the village was going about its lawful occasions. Mrs. Prout from the dairy passed with her cans, nodding a good morning. The vicar, Mr. Clement, hurried by with his sermon notes clutched to his chest like a shield. A boy on a bicycle whistled Tipperary off-key. None of them glanced at the horse trough or the memorial clock, which at that moment stood at 17 minutes past 9. Mrs. Harrowby closed the sketchbook, slipped the original drawing between its leaves, and tied the ribbon. She had no intention of showing it to Constable Pauck, not yet. Pauck was a worthy man, but he believed that crime arrived in Willowbank Green only when imported by trippers from Birmingham, and then only in the form of stolen bicycles. A sketch predicting murder would send him into a decline. Instead, she put on her gray bonnet, collected her folding stool and a fresh sheet of Whodunit and set out for the square. The sun was climbing, gilding the plane trees and striking sparks from the windows of the Anchor. She chose a position opposite the memorial, unfolded her stool, and sat. A clock on the cross showed 21 minutes past 10. She opened her sketchbook, sharpened her pencil with a penknife, and began to draw. She drew the trough, the iron railings, the shadow of the cross falling across the cobbles. She drew the place where the body ought to have been, and left it blank, a pale rectangle in the middle of the page. Around her the village moved, the baker's van, the grocer's boy, old Mr. Pike sweeping the steps of the post office. None of them noticed the old lady who drew crime scenes, or the way her eyes flicked every few minutes to the memorial clock. At 11 o'clock she packed her things and walked home. On the doorstep of Rose Cottage lay a second envelope, identical to the first. She picked it up, felt the weight of another sheet of Whatman, and knew that the game, whatever it was, had begun in earnest. Chapter 2. The Man Who Was Not There. Mrs. Harrowby carried the second envelope into her sitting room without haste, as though it were a commonplace bill from the coal merchant. The fire had burned low. She poked it into life, added a scoop of coal from the scuttle, and only then broke the scarlet seal. The paper was the same Whatman, the fold identical, the pencil strokes as confident as a surgeon's incision. This time the square was drawn at night, the gas lamp a pool of sulphur light, the plane trees black against a sky pricked with stars. And there, beneath the memorial cross, lay the body, precisely where the first sketch had promised it would fall. The top hat was dented now, the cane rolled into the gutter, one gloved hand flung outward as though in appeal. The face remained a blank oval, but the posture was unmistakable. The Major, or someone very like him, in the attitude of violent death. Beneath the drawing, in the same copperplate, "You missed the performance. Try again tomorrow." Mrs. Harrowby laid the two sketches side by side on the gate-legged table. The first had been prophetic, the second retrospective. Yet the hand was identical, the pressure of the pencil, the angle of the cross-hatching, the minute stippling that suggested the texture of cobblestones. She fetched her magnifying glass from the bureau drawer and bent over the drawings like a naturalist examining specimens. Under the lens, the graphite gleamed with microscopic facets. In the lower margin of the second sketch, she discerned a faint smudge, as though the artist had rested a thumb there while the lead was still wet. She sat back, removed her pince-nez, and polished the lenses with a corner of her handkerchief. Someone in Willowbank Green, or very near it, had drawn the square twice, once before the event, once after. Someone who knew the lie of the land as intimately as she did herself, who could predict the fall of a body and then record it with the comb of a surveyor. Someone, moreover, who wished her to know. The church clock struck 6, a mellow note that drifted across the roofs and settled in the chimneys. Mrs. Harrowby rose, lit the lamp, and drew the curtains against the dusk. She prepared a light supper-poached egg on toast, a slice of seed cake, a pot of tea strong enough to stand a spoon in, and ate it at the table with the sketches for company. When the plates were washed, and the fire banked for the night, she took her candle upstairs. In the spare bedroom she kept a small mahogany box that had once belonged to her brother the canon. Inside, wrapped in yellowing tissue, lay a Webley service revolver and a box of cartridges. She had never fired it, but she knew how to load it. She loaded it now, slipped it into the pocket of her dressing gown, and went to bed. Sleep came slowly. She lay listening to the small noises of the cottage, the tick of the bracket clock, the creak of the roof beams cooling, the faint rustle of mice behind the wainscot. At some hour after midnight she woke with a start. The moon had risen. A bar of silver lay across the counterpane. She rose, went to the window, and looked down into the lane. Nothing Gilead, nothing moved. The clematis stirred in the breeze, and far off a dog barked once and was silent. She returned to bed, but left the curtain undrawn, so that the moonlight might keep watch. Morning brought a fine drizzle, the sort that soaks through wool and tempers the spirit. Mrs. Harrowby breakfasted frugally, donned her mackintosh and a felt hat with a brim like a mushroom, and set out for the square. The memorial clock showed 14 minutes past 9. The church clock, visible through the lich gate, agreed. She unfolded her stool beneath the plane tree nearest the post office and opened her sketchbook to a fresh page. The square was empty save for Mr. Pike sweeping the pavement outside the post office and a pair of ducks waddling across the cobbles in search of crumbs. She began to draw the trough, the lamp, the memorial cross with its bronze wreath of laurel. She left the central space blank, as she had the day before, but this time she added the shadow of the cross, exactly as it fell at 9:15. The drizzle hissed on the paper. She sheltered the page with her umbrella. At 10:30, the baker's van drew up. Young Bert Hodge leapt down with a tray of loaves and a whistle. He nodded to Mrs. Harrowby. "Morning, ma'am." "Filthy weather for sketching." "Weather is immaterial to graphite, Bert," she replied. "It is the light that matters." He grinned and went on his way. Mrs. Harrowby continued to draw. She noted the position of every puddle, the angle at which the lamp leaned slightly to the left, a legacy of the VJ Day celebrations when the Home Guard had used it for target practice, the exact point where the shadow of the cross touched the rim of the horse trough. At 11 o'clock, she packed her things and walked home through the drizzle. The second envelope had foretold a performance. She intended to be in the audience. Rose Cottage felt damp and unwelcoming. She lit the fire, hung her mackintosh on the back of the kitchen door, and examined the Webley by daylight. It was clean, oiled, and heavy in her hand. She unloaded it, wrapped it in its tissue, and returned it to the mahogany box. Then she sat down with the sketches and a sheet of foolscap and began to make a list. The artist knows the square at night. The artist knows the memorial clock is slow by 2 minutes. The artist wishes me to witness something at 11:23 p.m. The artist delivered the second sketch after the event, therefore was present or near. The artist uses Whatman paper and a 2B pencil uncommon in the village. She underlined the last point twice. The only stationer within 10 miles who stopped Whatman was Mr. Ruddle in Market Basing, and he ordered it specially for the Art Society. She herself bought her supply there, twice a year. Someone else in Willowbank Green or a visitor had done the same. The afternoon post brought a picture postcard from her great-niece in Torquay, a view of the harbor with a message about sunburn and ice cream. Mrs. Harrowby turned it over, saw the postmark, and set it aside. At 4 o'clock she put on her stout shoes, took her umbrella, and walked to the post office. Miss Dovedale was sorting letters behind the grill, her steel-rimmed spectacles glinting. "Afternoon, Miss Dovedale. I wonder if you recall selling any Whatman paper recently?" Miss Dovedale pursed her lips. "Paper? We don't stock it, Mrs. Harrowby. You know that. Mr. Ruddle in Market Basing." "Yes, yes, but perhaps a visitor asked you to order it." Miss Dovedale considered. "There was a gentleman last week. Tall, military mustache, loud voice. Said he was staying at the Limes with his sister. Wanted a sketchbook and pencils. I told him to try Ruddle's. He wasn't pleased." Mrs. Harrowby thanked her and stepped outside. The drizzle had ceased. A watery sun glinted on the wet cobbles. The Limes was the residence of Mrs. Carstairs, whose brother, Major Blaine, had been expected any day from India. Mrs. Harrowby had never met the Major, but she had heard of him, a man who had lost money in gold mines and gained a reputation for blunt speech. She walked home slowly, her mind turning over possibilities like beads on a string. At Rose Cottage she found the fire still cheerful. She brewed tea, cut a slice of seed cake, and sat down to wait for night. The memorial clock, she knew, was visible from her upstairs window if she stood on a chair. She dragged the chair to the casement, opened the window a crack, and settled herself with a cushion and a shawl. The Webley she left in its box. Curiosity, not fear, was her companion tonight. The village settled into darkness. Lights winked out one by one. The post office, the anchor, the vicarage. At 10:30, the square was empty, the gas lamp hissing softly. Mrs. Harrowby's watch, an old half-hunter that had belonged to her father, showed 20 minutes past 11. She leaned forward. The memorial clock, catching the lamplight, showed 18 minutes past. 2 minutes slow as always. At 11:23, precisely by her watch, a figure stepped into the pool of light beneath the lamp. It was a man, tall, upright, carrying a cane. He wore a top hat and a caped overcoat. He paused beside the horse trough, looked about him, and then Mrs. Harrowby's breath caught. He struck the pose of the sketch, one hand on the cane, the other raised as though in greeting. For a moment he stood motionless, a silhouette cut from black paper. Then he stepped backward into the shadow of the memorial cross and was gone. Mrs. Harrowby waited. The church clock struck the quarter. Nothing moved. No shot, no cry, no fall of a body. Only the wind stirring the plane trees and the faint smell of pipe tobacco drifting across the square. She closed the window, descended the stairs, and lit the lamp. On the table lay her sketchbook, open to the blank space where the body ought to have been. She took her pencil, and with steady strokes drew the figure she had seen, the top hat, the cane, the caped coat. Beneath it she wrote, 11:23 p.m., the man who was not there. She blew out the lamp, climbed the stairs, and went to bed. The game, she reflected as sleep claimed her, had taken an unexpected turn. The corpse had failed to appear, but the actor had played his part to perfection. Tomorrow, she decided, she would call upon Mrs. Carstairs at the Limes and discover whether the Major had arrived and whether he owned a caped coat and a top hat. Outside, the memorial clock ticked on, 2 minutes slow, keeping its own counsel in the dark. Chapter 3. The Major's Return. Mrs. Elspeth Harrowby woke before the sparrows, a habit formed in the days when her brother the canon required early tea and a reading from the Psalms. The events of the night lay upon her mind like a light frost, the solitary figure beneath the lamp, the exactitude of the pose, the absence of any corpse. She rose, drew back the curtains, and looked across the lane to the square. The memorial clock showed 23 minutes past 6. The church clock, catching the first pale light, agreed within a second. No body lay beneath the cross. No cane or top hat marred the cobbles. Only Mr. Pike, early with his broom, swept yesterday's drizzle into the gutter. She dressed with care, the gray wool, the cameo brooch, the bonnet with the discreet veil. Breakfast was a boiled egg tapped open with military precision, and 2 cups of tea strong enough to float a horseshoe. At 8:30, she set out for the Limes, a square red brick house set back from the road behind a laurel hedge clipped into the shape of a battleship. Mrs. Carstairs received callers on Wednesdays, but Mrs. Harrowby judged that murder or the promise of it constituted an exception. The maid who opened the door wore the startled expression of one interrupted in the act of dusting the whatnot. "Mrs. Carstairs is at breakfast, ma'am. Tell her Mrs. Harrowby wishes to speak of an urgent matter concerning her brother." The maid vanished. Mrs. Harrowby waited in the hall, noting the umbrella stand of elephant feet, the barometer that had given up predicting anything, the portrait of a military gentleman with a mustache like a yard brush. The gentleman, she surmised, was the late Mr. Carstairs. The mustache had clearly intimidated the artist. Mrs. Carstairs appeared in a rustle of bombazine, wiping marmalade from her fingers with a napkin. She was a tall woman, with the carriage of a sergeant major and the voice of a contralto. "Mrs. Harrowby, this is unexpected. You said my brother?" "Major Blaine. Has he arrived?" "Yesterday noon, on the train from town. Why do you ask?" Mrs. Harrowby produced the first sketch from her reticule and unfolded it with the gravity of a conjurer revealing a card. Because last night, at 23 minutes past 11, a man answering this description posed beneath the memorial cross and then vanished. I watched from my window. No shot was fired. No body fell. Yet the drawing predicts a death at that precise moment. Mrs. Carstairs stared. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving the rouge she affected standing out like signal flags. Rupert? Posing? The man's incapable of posing for anything except a regimental photograph. And he was here last night, arrived in a rage about the slow clock in the square. Said it was 2 minutes out and threatened to write to the council. Was he in the house at 11:23? Mrs. Carstairs hesitated. He went to bed at 10. Said he had a headache from the journey. I heard him moving about later. His room is above mine. But I was reading Mrs. Henry Wood and paid no attention. Mrs. Harrowby folded the sketch. Might I see the Major? He's gone to the square to time the clock again. He has an Ingersoll watch and a bee in his bonnet about punctuality. Mrs. Harrowby thanked her and departed. The morning had turned bright, the sky washed clean by the night's drizzle. She walked briskly to the square, where she found Major Blaine planted beside the horse trough like a regimental sergeant on parade. He was a tall man, upright despite 60-odd years, with a mustache waxed to points sharp enough to open letters. He wore a tweed suit of aggressive checks and carried the silver-topped cane from the sketch. The top hat, she noted, was absent. In its place, a deerstalker at a rakish angle. He was addressing Mr. Pike, who leaned on his broom with the air of a man enduring a sermon. 2 minutes slow, my man. I checked it at 11 last night, and again at 6 this morning. The mechanism wants oiling. Tell the council, or I shall. Mr. Pike touched his cap. I'll mention it, Major. Though the clock's been 2 minutes slow since the Zeppelin scare in 16, and no one's died of it yet. Mrs. Harrowby approached. Good morning, Major Blaine. I am Mrs. Harrowby of Rose Cottage. Your sister tells me you arrived yesterday. The Major turned, subjecting her to a stare that had once reduced subalterns to jelly. Harrowby? Any relation to Canon Harrowby of St. Bottles? My late brother. Fine preacher. Terrible whist player. What can I do for you, ma'am? She unfolded the sketch and held it up. Did you, at 23 minutes past 11 last night, stand beneath the memorial cross in this attitude? The Major's mustache bristled. Certainly not. I was in my room with a headache and a hot water bottle, though I did look out the window at the clock-damned thing's a disgrace. Yet someone wearing a caped coat and a top hat, carrying this cane, posed exactly so, and then stepped into the shadow. Poppycock, some joker in fancy dress. Probably young Truscott from the solicitors. He's a taste for amateur theatricals. Mrs. Harrowby noted the cane. Ebony, silver top engraved with the initials R.B. She noted also the faint smell of pipe tobacco that clung to the Major's tweed. Your cane is distinctive, Major. Might someone have borrowed it? Borrowed? I'd have borrowed them a clip on the ear. It's been with me since Lucknow. He tapped the cane against the cobbles for emphasis. The sound rang sharp and final, echoing the sketch's prediction. Mrs. Harrowby folded the drawing away. Thank you, Major. I shall not detain you from your campaign against tardy clocks. She walked home deep in thought. The Major had denied the performance, yet the cane was identical, the posture rehearsed. Someone had impersonated him, or the Major lied. She resolved to discover which. At Rose Cottage, she found a third envelope on the mat. The seal was unbroken, the paper Watman. She carried it to the table, broke the wax, and unfolded the sheet. The square again, this time at dusk. The gas lamp newly lit, the shadows long. The body lay beneath the cross, but now the face was drawn, a caricature of Major Blaine, eyes staring, mouth open in a soundless shout. The cane lay broken, the top hat crushed. Beneath, in copperplate, tonight, 11:23. The clock will be correct. Mrs. Harrowby's pulse quickened. The game had escalated. She fetched the Webley from its box, loaded it with steady fingers, and slipped it into her reticule. Then she sat down to wait for night, the sketches spread before her like cards in a game of patience. Outside, the village prepared for evening. The anchor lit its lamps. The vicar locked the church. Mr. Pike coiled his hose. At 10:30, Mrs. Harrowby extinguished her own lamps, drew on her dark cloak, and slipped out into the lane. The square was deserted, the gas lamp hissing. She took up position in the shadow of the post office, her reticule heavy with the revolver. The church clock struck 11. The memorial clock, she noted with surprise, showed the same. Someone had adjusted it. At 11:23, precisely a figure stepped into the light. The Major, or his double, in caped coat and top hat, cane in hand. He walked to the center of the square, raised the cane in salute, and pitched forward as a shot cracked the night. The top hat rolled, the cane clattered. The figure lay motionless beneath the cross. Mrs. Harrowby stepped forward, revolver ready. But before she reached the body, a second figure darted from the shadow of the memorial. A slight man in a dark coat. He snatched the cane, kicked the hat into the gutter, and vanished between the houses. By the time Mrs. Harrowby reached the fallen man, the square was empty save for the hiss of the lamp and the smell of cordite. The body was warm. She turned it over. The face was the Major's, but the eyes stared sightlessly. A neat bullet hole pierced the temple. In the dead hand was clutched a revolver his own. She recognized the army model. Suicide or murder made to look so. She looked at the memorial clock. The hands stood at 11:23. The performance, it seemed, had kept its appointment after all. Chapter 4. The Constable's Dilemma. Constable Pauk arrived at 11:45, coat unbuttoned, helmet askew, and the expression of a man who has been dragged from a warm bed and a warmer dream. He carried a bull's-eye lantern that swung like a drunk pendulum and cast long, theatrical shadows across the cobbles. Behind him puffed Dr. Lowbridge, scarf wound twice round his throat, medical bag banging against his knee. The square, which 5 minutes earlier had been the stage for violent death, now resembled a village pageant interrupted by rain. Mrs. Harrowby stood a little apart, hands folded over the handle of her umbrella, the Webleys safely back in her reticule. She had not touched the body. She had merely closed the staring eyes with 2 fingers and placed the top hat decently over the face. The cane lay where the running man had kicked it. The revolver still smoked faintly in the dead hand. Pauk recovered his breath and his dignity together. "Lord love us, it's the Major." "Who found him?" "I did," Mrs. Harrowby replied calmly. "I was walking home from a call upon Miss Emery. She suffers from neuralgia when I heard the shot." The constable eyed her with the suspicion reserved for old ladies who wander abroad after 11. "At 23 minutes past, ma'am." "Queer time for visiting." "Neuralgia respects no clock, constable." Dr. Lowbridge knelt, lifted the hat, and gave a low whistle. "1 bullet, right temple. Powder burns. Close range, very close. Death instantaneous," he sniffed. "Army Webley. His own, I shouldn't wonder." Pauk scratched his chin. "Suicide, then?" "Appearances suggest it," the doctor said, "though I'll not swear till the post-mortem." Mrs. Harrowby permitted herself a small, ladylike cough. "If I may venture an observation, gentlemen, the Major was left-handed." He saluted with his left hand, signed Mrs. Carstairs' visitor's book with his left, and held his cane in his left. Yet the revolver is in his right hand, and the wound is on the right temple. The 2 men stared. Pauk recovered first. "Meaning?" "Meaning," said Mrs. Harrowby, "that a left-handed man does not usually shoot himself with his right hand, nor does he contrive to enter the wound on the less convenient side." Dr. Lowbridge rocked back on his heels. "By Jove, she's right. I'd have missed it." Constable Pauk looked suddenly unwell. Murder in Willowbank Green was as rare as snow in August, and infinitely more troublesome. He opened his notebook with fingers that trembled slightly. Name of witness? He demanded, as though procedure might save him. Elspeth Harrowby, Rose Cottage. And before you ask, I saw a second person, a man, slight build, dark coat, run from the shadows immediately after the shot. He snatched the cane and vanished toward the lane behind the post office. Pauk wrote laboriously. The lantern light caught the sweat on his forehead. Description? Too dark. But he moved like a clerk, not a laborer. The constable closed the book with a snap. I'll have to inform the chief constable. And Mrs. Carstairs' poor lady. He hesitated. You'll not leave the village, ma'am? I have no intention of doing so, Mrs. Harrowby replied with gentle irony. Murder has only just become interesting. By 1 o'clock, the square was crowded with half the village in dressing gowns. And curiosity. Mrs. Carstairs arrived supported by the vicar and smelling strongly of sal volatile. She took one look at the sheeted form and collapsed into a convenient deck chair provided by Mr. Pike. My brother. Who could have done this? Constable Pauk cleared his throat. We're treating it as suspicious, ma'am. Suspicious it is murder. Rupert had enemies. Everyone who ever invested in that wretched mine. She broke off, aware of listening ears. Mrs. Harrowby noted the pronoun, everyone, and filed it away. Sergeant Bowles arrived from market basing at dawn, a thin man with a face like a disappointed bloodhound. He listened to Pauk's report, examined the body, and then crooked a finger at Mrs. Harrowby. You seem to have been remarkably provident, madam. On the spot, at the exact minute. I might say the same of the murderer, Sergeant. Bowles permitted himself half a smile. Touché. Now tell me everything, and leave out nothing, not even the color of the moon. Mrs. Harrowby told him. She produced the 3 sketches from her reticule and laid them on the post office counter like a hand of cards. Bowles studied them in silence, his eyebrows climbing toward his hairline. Delivered by hand? No writing save the notes? None. And you kept them from Constable Pauk because Constable Pauk believes sketches are the work of mischievous boys. Murder, Sergeant, is rarely mischievous. Bowles tapped the 3rd drawing. This one shows the Major's face recognizable, even in caricature. Someone wished you to know the victim in advance, or wished me to believe I knew him, Mrs. Harrowby corrected. The first 2 sketches showed only a silhouette. The sergeant's eyes narrowed. You suspect impersonation? I suspect everything until it is proved impossible. Bowles folded the sketches carefully and placed them in an official envelope. These are evidence. You will, of course, receive a receipt. He paused. I shall require a list of every soul who knew the Major was returning. That will be simple, Mrs. Harrowby said. The village has 19 houses, 1 public house, and a post office. News travels faster than the London Express. She left him measuring angles with a tape and walked home through the pale morning. The square already wore its everyday face. The baker's van, children on their way to school, Mr. Pike hosing away the last traces of tragedy. Only the memorial clock, now correct to the second, reminded her that time itself had been tampered with. At Rose Cottage she found a 4th envelope on the mat. The seal was unbroken. She carried it to the table, broke the wax, and drew out a single sheet. The square again, drawn by lamplight, the body removed, the cobble scrubbed clean. Beneath, in the familiar copperplate, well done. The next performance will be more intimate. Watch the limes tonight. Mrs. Harrowby looked at the grandfather clock in the hall. The hands stood at 20 minutes past 9. She had the entire day to prepare. She fetched the Webley, checked the cylinders, and laid it on the table beside the sketches. Then she sat down with a fresh sheet of foolscap and began to write names. Mrs. Carstairs, Mr. Truscott, solicitor's clerk owed money. Miss Dovedale, postmistress refused check. Mr. Pike, accused of stealing bulbs. The unknown runner in the dark coat. She underlined the last twice and added a question mark. Outside, the village buried its dead major with decent haste and prepared for the inquest. Inside Rose Cottage, Mrs. Elspeth Harrowby sharpened her pencils and waited for night. The game, she reflected, had moved from the public stage to a private drawing room, and drawing rooms were her natural territory. Chapter 5. The circle of suspects. The inquest was held in the parish hall at 11 o'clock on Thursday morning, the coroner having motored over from Market Basing with the air of a man who would rather be fishing. The hall smelled of varnish, hymn books, and the faint, unmistakable tang of carbolic from the Women's Institute cleaning rhoda. Every bench was filled. Latecomers stood 3 deep at the back, clutching handbags and opinions. Mrs. Harrowby took a seat near the front, sketchbook closed on her lap, and observed the assembly with the detached interest of a naturalist in the field. Sergeant Bowles gave evidence first. The body discovered at 11:23 p.m. 1 bullet wound, revolver in the right hand, left-handed victim. Dr. Lowbridge followed, confirming instantaneous death and the awkwardness of the wound. Mrs. Carstairs, veiled in black crepe, wept audibly into a handkerchief, edged with lace deep enough for a ball gown. Mr. Truscott, the solicitor's clerk, sat beside her twisting a signet ring. Miss Dovedale occupied the row behind, lips compressed as though guarding state secrets. Mr. Pike, in his Sunday suit 2 sizes too large, stared at the floorboards. The coroner, a thin man with a voice like a cracked bell, addressed the jury 6 local worthies, who looked as though they had been dragged from plow and counter. You have heard the medical evidence. The question is, accident, suicide, or murder? A murmur rippled through the hall. Mrs. Harrowby opened her sketchbook and began, unobtrusively, to draw the jury. The baker with flour in his eyebrows, the grocer polishing spectacles on a greasy apron, the farmer whose boots still carried the scent of the buyer. Sergeant Bowles was recalled. We are treating the death as suspicious. Certain anomalies, the position of the revolver, the adjustment of the memorial clock point to foul play. Mrs. Carstairs gave a muffled shriek. My brother had enemies. That gold mine. The coroner rapped with his gavel. Madam, restrain yourself. We are not concerned with mines, but with manner of death. Mrs. Harrowby raised a gloved hand. If I may assist, sir? The coroner peered over his spectacles. You are? Elspeth Harrowby, Rose Cottage. I discovered the body. Proceed. She rose, sketchbook in hand. 3 drawings were delivered to me anonymously, predicting the event. The first 2 showed a silhouette. The third, the major's face. All were executed on Whatman paper with a 2B pencil materials not commonly sold in the village. The memorial clock, habitually 2 minutes slow, was corrected on the night of the murder. Someone wished the time of death to be precise. She laid the sketches on the table. The jury craned forward. The coroner adjusted his pince-nez. Furthermore, Mrs. Harrowby continued, a second person was seen fleeing the scene immediately after the shot. He took the cane and kicked the hat into the gutter actions, suggesting haste and familiarity with the ground. Mr. Truscott leapt up. I object. This is conjecture. Sit down, sir, the coroner snapped. You will have your turn. The jury retired for 7 minutes, an interval filled with coughing and the rustle of peppermints. They returned with a verdict. Willful murder by person or persons unknown. The hall emptied in a babble of speculation. Mrs. Harrowby gathered her sketches and walked, home through a wind that smelled of wood smoke and impending frost. At Rose Cottage she found the promised 5th envelope. The seal was intact. She carried it to the table, broke the wax, and unfolded the sheet. This time the drawing was not of the square, but of the interior of the limes. The drawing room with its cabbage rose wallpaper, the marble clock on the mantel, the portrait of the late Mr. Carstairs glaring down. In the foreground, Mrs. Carstairs lay slumped across the sofa, a dagger protruding from her back. Beneath, in copperplate, tonight, 10.45. The circle closes. Mrs. Harrowby looked at the clock in her own hall. 20 minutes past 3? She had 7 hours. She sat down with fresh foolscap and drew a plan of the limes for memory hall, stairs, drawing room, conservatory. She marked windows, doors, the position of the sofa. Then she wrote letters beside the names. A Mrs. Carstairs, motive, inheritance, quarrel over will. B. Mr. Truscott, motive, unpaid loan, argument overheard by maid. C. Miss Dovedale, motive, refused check, public slight. D. Mr. Pike, motive, accusation of theft, threatened dismissal. E. Unknown runner, motive. She underlined E 3 times. At 4:30, she put on her dark cloak, slipped the Webley into her reticule, and walked to the limes. The maid admitted her with the air of one expecting bad news. Mrs. Carstairs is lying down. The shock, you know. Tell her I have information concerning the sketches. I will wait in the drawing room. The maid hesitated, then showed her in. The room was exactly as drawn. Wallpaper, clock, portrait. The sofa faced the fireplace. French windows opened onto the garden. Mrs. Harrowby took a chair beside the door, opened her sketchbook, and began to draw the room from life, comparing it stroke for stroke with the anonymous version. The dagger was rendered with particular care, broad blade, ivory handle, a chip on the left side. At 6 o'clock, Mrs. Carstairs entered, still in black, but with veil raised. Her eyes were red but steady. You have news? I have a warning, Mrs. Harrowby said. Tonight at 10:45, someone intends you harm in this room. I propose to prevent it. Mrs. Carstairs sank onto the sofa. Rupert's ghost? Less supernatural. Someone who draws with precision and kills with equal exactitude. The lady of the house rang for tea. While they drank it strong, with thin bread and butter, Mrs. Harrowby explained the sketches, the clock, the fleeing figure. Mrs. Carstairs listened, twisting a diamond ring. Rupert changed his will last month. Left everything to a missionary society in Pune. I get the house, but the capital. Enough to anger an expectant heir? There is no heir. Only me and the missionaries. At 9 o'clock the household settled. The maid locked up. The cook retired to her attic. Mrs. Carstairs, persuaded by Mrs. Harrowby, took a glass of hot milk and went to bed. Mrs. Harrowby remained in the drawing room, lamp turned low, Webley in her lap. She drew the room again, this time including herself in the corner, a small gray figure with watchful eyes. At 10:30, the marble clock chimed. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the French windows. Mrs. Harrowby rose, crossed to the windows, and checked the catechucure. She returned to her chair. The hands crept forward. 10:40, 10:43, 10:44. At 10:45, precisely, the lamp flickered. A draught swept the room. Mrs. Harrowby turned. The door to the hall stood ajar, though she had closed it. A figure slipped through slight, dark-coated, a scarf masking the lower face. In the right hand glinted a dagger, broad blade, ivory handle, a chip on the left side. Mrs. Harrowby raised the Webley. Drop it, the figure froze. The scarf slipped. Mr. Truscott's pale face stared back, eyes wide behind spectacles. You? Mrs. Carstairs' voice from the doorway. She stood in her dressing gown, hair in papers, a candle trembling in her hand. Truscott's hand opened. The dagger clattered to the carpet. I only meant to frighten her. The sketches were to prove I knew about the will. Mrs. Harrowby kept the revolver steady. You shot the major. No. I found him, dead posed him for the sketch to create confusion. Lies, Mrs. Carstairs said. You argued with Rupert about the loan. He threatened to expose you for forging his signature on the mine papers. Truscott's knees buckled. He sank to the floor, sobbing. I didn't mean murder. The revolver went off. Sergeant Bowles, summoned by telephone, arrived with Constable Pauk to find the tableau complete. Mrs. Carstairs rigid with fury, Mrs. Harrowby calm as a judge, Truscott a heap on the Axminster. The dagger was a stage property, the blade retractable. The threat had been bluff, but the confession was real. Later, in the police car, Truscott babbled. The loan, the forged papers, the quarrel in the square, the accidental shot, the frantic sketches to muddy the waters. The runner in the dark coat had been himself, returning to adjust the clock and plant the final drawing. At Rose Cottage, Mrs. Harrowby received a last envelope empty save for a single sheet of Whatman, blank. She pinned it above the mantelpiece, beside the others. The circle, she reflected, had closed with a satisfying click. Chapter 6. The Reconstruction. The following Monday dawned bright and blustery, the sort of morning that sets curtains flapping and sends chimney smoke racing across the sky. Willowbank Green, having buried its major with full military honors and dispatched Mr. Truscott to Market Basing Jail, prepared to forget. The memorial clock had been reset to its habitual 2-minute lag. The horse trough was scrubbed clean. The cobbles bore no trace of tragedy. Only the sketches pinned above Mrs. Harrowby's mantelpiece remained as evidence that anything untoward had occurred. Yet Mrs. Harrowby was not satisfied. Truscott's confession, though voluble, contained gaps wide enough for a regiment to march through. He admitted the quarrel, the accidental discharge of the revolver, the frantic sketches delivered to establish an alibi of prophecy. He denied, however, any knowledge of the second figure seen fleeing the square, the slight man who had snatched the cane and kicked the hat. I was alone, he insisted. Panic-stricken and half-mad, Sergeant Bowles accepted the plea. The jury at the assizes would decide. Mrs. Harrowby reserved judgment. At 9:30, she walked to the square with her folding stool and a fresh sheet of Whatman. The village was at its weekday tasks. The baker's van, the grocer's boy on his bicycle, Mr. Pike sweeping with the air of a man who had never heard of murder. She set her stool opposite the memorial, opened her sketchbook, and began to draw not the square as it was, but as it had been on the night of the crime. She drew the gas lamp, the plane trees, the shadow of the cross at 11:23. She drew the body exactly as she had found it. Revolver in the right hand, top hat over the face, cane in the gutter. Then, in the margin, she drew the fleeing figure slight, dark-coated, scarf to the chin. At 11 o'clock, Sergeant Bowles arrived, notebook in hand. He watched her for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Still at it, Mom. Memory fades, Sergeant. Graphite does not." He glanced at the drawing. "That's the runner you saw?" "The same. He moved like a clerk, not a navvy." And he knew precisely where the cane would fall. Bowles scratched his chin. "Truscott swears he acted alone. Truscott is a liar and a forger. He is also 5 feet 10 inches tall and broad in the shoulder. The runner was no more than 5 feet 6, narrow as a boy." The sergeant's eyebrows rose. "You measured him?" "With my eyes, Sergeant. I have sketched enough village cricket teams to know a man's height by the set of his shoulders." Bowles closed his notebook. "Then we have an accomplice, or a second murderer," Mrs. Harrowby said quietly. "The revolver was the Major's own. Truscott claims it went off in the struggle. Yet the wound was neat, the powder burns consistent with a shot fired at 2 inches. A struggle produces chaos, not precision." She folded her stool and walked home. At Rose Cottage, she found a plain envelope, no wax seal, this time containing a single sheet of Whatman. The drawing showed the square at dawn, empty, the cobbles wet with dew. Beneath, in the familiar copperplate, one loose thread remains. Pull it at the inquest tomorrow. The inquest into Mrs. Carstairs' attempted murder was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the parish hall. Mrs. Harrowby spent the morning preparing. She drew a plan of the Limes drawing room, marking the position of the sofa, the French windows, the door to the hall. She drew the retractable dagger, the lamp, the marble clock. Then she dressed with care gray wool, cameo brooch, bonnet with the discreet veil, and set out. The hall was crowded again, but the atmosphere had shifted from tragedy to farce. Mrs. Carstairs, restored to bombazine and righteousness, sat in the front row flanked by the vicar and Miss Dovedale. Mr. Truscott, brought from jail under escort, looked pale and sullen in handcuffs. Sergeant Bowles stood at the side, arms folded. The coroner rapped for order. "We are here to determine the circumstances of the attempted assault upon Mrs. Amelia Carstairs on the night of the 23rd ultimo. Mrs. Carstairs gave evidence first. The shock of the Major's death, her collapse, the arrival of Mrs. Harrowby with warnings, the appearance of Truscott with the dagger. She identified the weapon bought years ago at a charity bazaar for a pageant of Ivanhoe. Truscott, questioned, admitted the attempt to frighten, denied intent to kill. Mrs. Harrowby was called. She laid her sketches on the table. On the night of the Major's death, she began, I saw a second figure flee the square immediately after the shot. This person was slight, no more than 5'6", and moved with the agility of youth. Mr. Truscott is taller and heavier. Someone assisted him or acted independently. A murmur ran through the hall. The coroner frowned. You suggest 2 assailants? I suggest, Mrs. Harrowby said, that the Major's death was not the accident Truscott claims. The revolver was fired deliberately, the body arranged, the clock adjusted. The sketches were sent to confuse, not to predict. She turned to Truscott. You forged the Major's signature on the mine papers. You quarreled in the square. But you did not fire the fatal shot. You arrived after, to find the body posed and the clock already corrected. You panicked, drew the later sketches, and delivered them to me to create the illusion of foreknowledge. Truscott's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Lies! I told you. You told Sergeant Bowles what you thought would save your neck, but the runner took the cane. Why? Unless to prevent it being traced. She produced the cane from beneath her cloak ebony, silver top engraved R.B. She had retrieved it from the gutter at dawn, wrapped in brown paper. This was found in the possession of Mr. Pike's nephew, Alfred Pike, aged 17, apprentice to Mr. Ruddle the stationer in Market Basing. Alfred purchased Watman paper and 2B pencils on the 15th. He has a talent for drawing and a grievance. The Major accused his uncle of stealing tulip bulbs and threatened to have him dismissed from the garden committee. The hall erupted. Mr. Pike rose, red-faced. My Alf? He's a good boy. A boy, Mrs. Harrowby said gently, who idolized his uncle and hated the Major for the insult. He followed Truscott to the square, saw the quarrel, and seized his chance. He shot the Major with the Major's own revolver taken earlier from the trunk in the hall, arranged the body, adjusted the clock, and fled. Truscott arrived moments later, found the scene set, and improvised his confession. Sergeant Bowles stepped forward. Young Alfred Pike was brought in, trembling, ink still on his fingers. He confessed at once the theft of the revolver, the hiding in the shadow of the memorial, the shot fired in rage, the frantic sketches drawn in Mr. Ruddle's back room and delivered by hand to Rose Cottage. Truscott, stumbling upon the body, had panicked and embroidered the tale. The coroner returned a verdict of willful murder against Alfred Pike, with Truscott as accessory after the fact. The hall emptied in a buzz of righteous satisfaction. Mrs. Harrowby walked home through the dusk. At Rose Cottage she found a final envelope plain, unsealed. Inside was a child's drawing, the square at sunrise, the memorial cross casting a long, harmless shadow. Beneath, in a round, unformed hand, Thank you, ma'am. I am sorry. She pinned it beside the others, brewed a pot of tea, and sat down to contemplate the fire. The loose thread had been pulled. The pattern was complete. Willowbank Green would sleep soundly tonight, and Mrs. Elspeth Harrowby, the old lady who drew crime scenes, would return to her watercolors until the next envelope slid through her letterbox. Chapter 7. The Last Sketch. The assizes came and went with the swift inevitability of a winter cold. Alfred Pike, pale and undersized in the dock, pleaded guilty to manslaughter. The jury, moved by his youth and the major's provocation, recommended mercy. He was sentenced to 5 years' detention. Mr. Truscott, convicted of forgery and accessory after the fact, drew 3 years' hard labor. The village, having devoured the scandal like a suet pudding, wiped its collective mouth and turned to the more pressing matter of the Christmas bazaar. Mrs. Harrowby attended neither trial. She had given her evidence to Sergeant Bowles in a neat deposition, illustrated with 3 precise sketches: the square at 11:23 p.m., the trajectory of the fatal bullet, the exact position of the runner's footprints in the dew. The sketches were entered as exhibits and returned to her afterwards, edges curled from handling by barrister's fingers. She filed them in the mahogany box beside the Webley, now cleaned and wrapped in fresh tissue. On the first Tuesday in December, the postman brought no letters, only the parish magazine and a bill from the coal merchant. Mrs. Harrowby paid the bill, rolled the magazine into a spill for the fire, and stood at her window watching the square. Snow had fallen in the night, a thin, apologetic dusting that turned the cobbles to sugar and the memorial cross to a confectioner's fancy. Children pelted one another with snowballs. Mr. Pike, restored to the garden committee, swept the path with stately sweeps of his broom. The clock on the memorial showed 2 minutes slow, as though nothing had changed. Yet everything had. The anchor had a new sign, the Major's Rest, painted in gilt with a silhouette of a top hat. Mrs. Carstairs had departed for Torquay, leaving the limes shuttered and a notice to let in the post office window. Miss Dovedale sold stamps with renewed vigor, as though volume might erase memory. Only Mrs. Harrowby remained unaltered, gray and upright, sketching the square from her window with the calm of a chronicler recording the return of seasons. At 3:30, the light began to fail. She lit the lamp, drew the curtains, and set a kettle on the hob. As the water sang, she heard the soft thud of an envelope pushed through the letterbox. She rose, unhurried, and picked it up. Plain cream paper, no seal, her name in the round schoolboy hand that had written the last note of contrition. She carried it to the table, slit it with the bread knife, and drew out a single sheet of Whatman. The drawing was of Rose Cottage itself, seen from the lane. The pink-washed walls, the clematis now bare, the porch light glowing like a welcoming eye. In the foreground stood a small figure herself, unmistakable in bonnet and cloak holding a sketchbook. At her feet lay a scatter of envelopes, each sealed with scarlet wax. Above the roof, the sky was filled with stars, and beneath the drawing, in careful copperplate restored, the old lady who drew crime scenes has closed the book. Thank you for the lesson. No signature. None was needed. Mrs. Harrowby studied the sketch for a long while. The hand was Alfred Pike's, matured in 6 weeks of prison draftsmanship classes, the cross-hatching confident, the perspective flawless. She turned the sheet over. On the reverse, in pencil so faint it might have been breath, "I draw gardens now. The governor says I have talent." She smiled, the small, private smile of one who has recognized a spark and fanned it into flame without sentiment. She fetched a pin from the sewing basket, climbed onto a chair, and added the new sketch to the row above the mantelpiece. The sequence was complete: prophecy, fulfillment, confession, resolution, epilogue. The kettle boiled. She made tea, cut a slice of Madeira cake, and sat by the fire. Outside, the snow thickened, muffling the village in cotton wool. The church clock struck 6. The memorial clock, 2 minutes later, echoed it with a cough. Mrs. Harrowby lifted her cup in a silent toast to absent artists and to the quiet square where no body would fall tonight. She opened her sketchbook to a fresh page and began to draw not crime, but the first snowdrops pushing through the flower bed beneath her window, their green spears brave against the white. The pencil moved with the old precision, but the subject was new. Crime scenes, she reflected, were finished business. Gardens were the future. At 9 o'clock, she banked the fire, locked the door, and went upstairs. The Webley remained in its box. The sketches kept watch above the mantel. Willowbank Green slept under its blanket of snow, and Mrs. Elspeth Harrowby, the old lady who had drawn crime scenes to their conclusion, closed her eyes upon a world restored to order. In the morning, the postman would bring the usual bills and circulars. No cream envelope would slide through the letterbox. The performance was over, the curtain rung down, the actors dispersed. And if, in years to come, a watercolor of exceptional delicacy appeared in the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition, signed simply a Pike and depicting a village square at peace, Mrs. Harrowby would smile, pin a discreet rosette to her bonnet, and take the train to London to see it. But that was for the future. Tonight she slept, the snow tapping gently at the panes like a visitor who has learned not to disturb the house.